Hello again, this is Janelle Yancey from the University of Arkansas, and I'm going to finish up the retail ID slides for identifying retail cuts for meat judging. This one will include pork and lamb. You'll have to find the beef retail ID in a different video. So we're going to start out with pork, and in pork, there's a few little hints that comes with pork. Pork has both chops and steaks, where most of the time the steaks are from beef and chops are from lamb. Pork has both. In pork, chops are always in the loin primal. Chops will always have a backbone, or they had a backbone at one time. There's some boneless chops that obviously don't have a backbone. Steaks are from the shoulder, and steaks will not have a backbone. So that's a little bit of hint for you when it comes to identifying chops and steaks from pork. And pork also has smoked cuts. And smoked cuts look like the unsmoked versions. They come from the primal cuts, just like the unsmoked versions do. But they're going to have a brown color to their fat, and they're going to have kind of a smoky smell. You can actually smell the smoke on them. And because they're smoked, they have a different retail code, or they're a different answer when it comes to the retail cuts on your score sheet. So you need to make sure you're looking when it comes to pork that you're putting in the smoked cut versus the fresh cut. So starting off in the front end and the pork shoulder. The pork shoulder is divided into two main parts. It's got the Boston blade, which is the top part of the shoulder. The Boston blade, it includes the blade bone. It is the top part up here. It's got a lot of muscle. It's got that blade bone in it. It's got lots of little muscles. It's going to be a big square chunk, and you'll be able to see a flat bone on one surface, and around the corner there'll be a round bone. So those are both part of the blade bone, but that's where they've separated it off right here. And so on the other side, if you flip that cut over, there's going to be a layer of fat. And when I was a kid, I always used to think that layer of fat looked like snow, and it snowed a lot in Boston, and so that's how I remembered that it was the Boston blade. The arm picnic is the lower part, or the more ventral part of the pork shoulder, and it's got the little leg that sticks out here. So when you see that leg, you need to think picnic, because you walk to a picnic. Sometimes the picnic is going to have the skin on it. You may see a smoked version of the arm picnic, and that's going to be a different code. So if you're looking at a picnic roast and it's smoked, make sure you type in that you answer with that different code. A few more cuts from the shoulder. You can slice off a bone-in arm roast that comes from down here, and you've got that round arm bone in it. It's going to have lots of little muscles. It's a leaner cut than some others. You won't see the skin on it. So if it's pork and it's got a big circle in it, it's a great big roast. That round bone is going to be visible on the other side as well, so you know you're looking at an arm roast. Now you could slice that into steaks and have an arm steak. And if you remember from the beef slides, we talked about, you're in the front end when you have a round bone next to a round muscle. Now the round muscles are a little bit harder to see in the pork carcass, because they're a little bit different shape than they are in beef and lamb. But you can also see that long skinny muscle, lots of little muscles. You're looking at the front end, at the shoulder, and you've got an arm steak. And in pork, it's always going to be an arm steak, because it comes from the shoulder and there's no backbone associated with it. Now, also in the pork shoulder, you can cut steaks out of the Boston blade, and those are called blade steaks. Again, lots of little muscles. It's in the shoulder, and it has no backbone. If you'll see, there's no backbone associated with this. You've got the nice blade bone. In the beef carcass, we had the blade bone when it looked like this. We called it a 7-bone. There's no 7-bone in pork, so it's going to be a blade steak from the shoulder. If we were to start cutting chops from up here that still had that were out of the loin but still had blade in them, those would be blade chops, and they're a little bit different. Okay, so now we've moved into the loin. Pork does not have a rib primal. So if you'll remember in beef and when we talk about lamb, you know, all these cuts that had the ribs on them were part of the rib primal. That doesn't exist in pork. When butchers cut pork, they cut out the loin in one big long piece, and they'll actually market that loin as a whole piece, or they might cut it into different chops. And so there's lots of different chops that you can get out of the pork loin. If you start up here in the anterior portion or toward the head of the carcass, you're going to get blade chops. They're going to have the blade bone in them. It's got a backbone. You can see the vertebral column there. That's the backbone. It comes out of the loin, so you know it's a chop. You continue moving on down the backbone, and you'll start getting into rib chops. You can see the rib bone. It's curved. It'll have a round end on the bottom down here. The rib bone is attached to a vertebrae, so you know it's a chop. And it will not have a tenderloin, so that's when you know you're looking at a rib chop. Continue on down, you'll start to see presence of that tenderloin, and that tells you you have a loin chop. They look like little fat T-bone steaks. So you've got a top loin side and a tenderloin side, and then this T-shaped bone in the middle, and they come from the lumbar version or the lumbar vertebrae, and that's going to be a loin chop. And then you get down here and you start cutting out chops that have the pelvic bone in them. That pelvic bone, you can see it's got all kinds of funny shapes, and as you cut chops from different places, you're going to have different shapes of that bone, and it's kind of got this half moon shape cut, and those are going to be sirloin chops. And a lot of times those sirloin chops are going to be kind of two-tone in color. And we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these chops as we continue on in the pork loin. Okay, so in the pork loin, you have the blade roast. So that's going to be the first roast that comes out of the pork loin. It's going to have a blade bone at one end, and then a blade, and then it's going to kind of look like a rib chop on this end. You might still see the blade bone there. So that's going to be a blade roast. You're going to look for that backbone. Then you could cut that into chops and make blade chops. Again, the blade chop has got to have the backbone. If it doesn't have a backbone, it's not a blade chop, it's a rib chop. Or it's got to have the blade bone. If it doesn't have the blade bone, it's not a blade chop. And it's got to have the backbone, or it's a blade steak. Now, you can take these blade chops and you can cut out the rib eye muscle or the loin eye muscle and this little cap that goes over it, and sometimes the butchers will do that, and that makes a blade chop boneless. And these guys, they look like little bitty pork ribeye steaks. They're going to be pork colored. They've got that cap muscle on them. A lot of times they're two-toned, where the cap muscle is a lot darker than the main loin eye part of the muscle, and those are blade chop boneless. They're little oval pieces, and you can see that this blade chop, you can see the little boneless chop in there. You remove that, and that's what these guys look like. Now, the rib chop is going to be further down the carcass from the blade chop. It won't have a blade bone. It also will not have a tenderloin. So if you keep going on down, there's going to be a tenderloin that appears. But the rib chop has a rib bone. The rib bones are going to be curved. You'll see them kind of circular down here on the bottom edge. You'll see that backbone that the rib is attached to. It's going to have this nice big round muscle, the loin eye muscle. There's a smoked version of those rib chops, and you can see that it's got this brown fat. It's going to have a lighter muscle, and it will smell smoky. Ribbed roasts are going to have a rib chop on one end, and then they may look a little bit like a blade chop on the other end. But they're not going to be, the blade bone's not going to go all the way through them. So another cut that comes from the pork loin would be the back ribs. So what they've done is they've just taken the muscle off of the rib, and that just leaves just the ribs, and you can barbecue those. You'll see ribs on both edges, and the edges are really straight. And this comes from the loin. There's another type of ribs called spare ribs, that come from down here that are a different cut, and they come from the spare ribs. Back ribs come from the loin, and this is why, because they're up here, you remove them from the loin. The loin chop looks like a little fat T-bone. They're a little bit rounder than a T-bone. Of course, they're pink. They've got a top loin side and a tenderloin side. They've got that T-shaped bone, and they look like little T-bones. And again, there's a smoked version of them that's going to be a different cut with a different number. And then the loin roast is going to look like a rib chop on one end down here, and it's going to look like a loin chop on the other end. And you're going to look for that tenderloin. If you see the tenderloin, and it looks, even if it has a rib chop on one end, it's got a loin chop on the other, that's a loin roast. So, furthermore, in the loin, you can have the top loin chops, and then there's a top loin chop boneless. And this is where this is the top side of that T-bone, or the top side of that loin chop. It's got kind of a oval shape. It's one continuous muscle. You may see it bone in. You may see it boneless. The boneless ones are a little bit more, they're a little bit more oval. Now, don't worry, there's not a boneless rib chop, so you don't have to look at that and say, oh my gosh, is that a rib chop, or is that a boneless loin chop? If it's boneless, it's going to be a loin chop, unless it's got that cap on it like those boneless blade chops did. You do need to make sure that if it's bone in, that it doesn't have a rib in it before you call it a top loin chop instead of a rib chop. Now, you can take those boneless loin chops, cut them a little bit thick, and then cut them right down the middle and fold them open, and it looks like a butterfly, and that's a butterfly chop. Those are always boneless. They kind of look like two boneless loin chops that have been stuck together. That's a really easy one to identify. It's a pork loin butterfly chop. If you leave that pork loin roast all intact, it's going to be a boneless pork top loin roast, boneless. It could be as long as 4 inches, or it could be much longer. The strings are just, kind of there to hold it in place. Don't worry about those strings. So it's just going to be one loin eye muscle. It's going to be the top loin roast. And then the tenderloin roast is a smaller cut. It's not going to be any wider than 2 inches across. Sometimes it looks a little bit like a tongue. It's going to have a nice edge on it down here at one end. It's going to taper to one end. It's going to look very porky, have that real pork color, nice pork color to it. So further down in the loin, we get to the sirloin chops. Now, those sirloin chops are cut off over the pelvic bone, and that pelvic bone has lots of different crazy shapes. So you're going to see this big half moon shaped muscle over a funky shaped bone. And so that's going to be a sirloin chop. Related to that would be the sirloin roast. So it's going to look like a loin chop on one end. There's the top loin, there's the tenderloin, but then it's going to move into a sirloin chop on the other end, and you'll see this big hump on it. So you're getting the very end of the loin here, and that's going to be a sirloin chop. And you'll see that the tenderloin will actually run from one end to the other in a sirloin roast, where it doesn't in a loin roast. Okay, so the last cut, or one of the last cuts from the pork loin, are the sirloin cutlets, and that's just pretty much a boneless sirloin chop, where they've cut the top half for that main muscle off of the sirloin chops, and they've created these sirloin cutlets. Why they don't call them sirloin chops boneless, I don't know, but they're sirloin cutlets. And you can see the sirloin, if you remember from beef, it has this funky shaped connective tissue that's still there in the pork carcass. So you can see that funky shaped connective tissue. It's that half moon shape. Sometimes you'll see it's a little bit two-toned, where it's light on the outside and dark in the center. So you'll see that, and you'll think, okay, those are sirloin cutlets. That's another one. You'll see you can find these in the grocery store. That's a good one to go look at, because it's kind of hard to explain what that one looks like. Okay, so below the loin is the pork side, or the pork belly. And there's 3 cuts that come out of the pork belly. First off, there's the uncured bacon, which is just a big slab of uncured fresh side. And it's going to look like a big slab of bacon, but it's not cured, so it's not brown. It's still going to be fresh. Then there's slab bacon, which is the smoked bacon that you'll see as a whole unsliced, or there's bacon sliced that's going to be smoked. You'll see the brown, it'll smell like smoke, and it'll be sliced up. So those are pretty easy. They come from the pork side. The spare ribs is its own primal cut. Spare ribs are going to look different from the back ribs. They come from the spare ribs primal cut, and they are kind of a D shape. You'll see that D shape where it's rounded on one end and then straight on the other, where they've cut it off from the loin and then they've removed it from the belly. You'll see part of the diaphragm, and so that's the pork spare ribs. Moving on down into the ham or the leg. In pork, it's called the ham. In lamb, it's called the leg. But it's the same. It's the same letter indicator on your score sheet. There is the rump portion, which is going to be the part that's up on the upper side of the leg. It's going to have a pelvic bone or an H bone in it. It's kind of a funny shaped bone. You're not going to see the leg part. You're going to see that round femur bone. And then the shank portion has the leg. It looks a little bit different than the arm picnic. The leg is kind of straight out from the set face. It doesn't have that bend in it like the arm picnic does. You know you're in the back leg because there's fewer large muscles. So you know you're in the back leg. And then if you cut a cut right out of the middle of the leg, that's going to be the center slice. And if you'll look, it's very similar to the round steak in beef. So you've got a top round, eye of round, and a bottom round. But this is in the ham, and then you've got your vastus group or your knuckle at the front. So you've got a big cut from the middle of the ham. It's got a round bone right in the middle, fewer large muscles. All of these cuts you'll see in the smoked version. There's a smoked ham boneless. That's a big boneless smoked ham. That's gonna have the smoke smell, the smoke color. You'll see netting on it from where it hung in the smokehouse. And then there's a rump portion, a shank portion, and a center slice that are all available in the smoked side of pork. Okay, there's a few other cuts that come, they're boneless cuts that come out of the ham that are a little bit newer. There's a tip roast that comes out of the ham. It's similar to the beef knuckle. It's a big round cut. You know, it's going to be bigger than a softball, quite a bit bigger than a softball. It's going to be in front of this round muscle. It looks a lot like but it's one big continuous chunk of muscle, not going to be a lot of fat on it. The muscle fibers run the direction away from the cut surface. And then there's the top roast, which is similar to the top round roast. And these are cuts that are sold or that are cut up and sold separately. And it's kind of a newer thing. So it's a little bit flatter. It's cut surface there, and then you can see the fibers kind of run in a diagonal direction. These are some that you're just gonna have to see a few of these to know what you're looking at. And I hate to tell you that, but you just got to find some pictures and some of these to see them. So the next cut is a cut that's in the pork various, and the reason they call it's in the various is because these country style ribs can be cut from the loin, or they can be cut from the shoulder. And so what you're doing is you're taking a blade steak or a blade chop and you're slicing that chop in half, and that's creating country style ribs. And so you'll see that done sometimes with blade steaks, and you'll see it sometimes done with blade chops, and it creates kind of these poor man ribs where They've just been sliced in half, and you can cook them just like a rib. Lots of little muscles, and they're found in the various primal because they can be in a couple of different places on the carcass. A few other pork various that you'll see is ground pork. You're going to see the noodles. It's going to be a lot lighter red than beef. Pork cube steak, same as beef. It's just a pork steak that they've run through the tenderizer, and so you're going to have this cubed or square tenderizing effect on the edge of it. It's going to be lighter colored than beef, and usually the cuts are actually smaller than what you'll see in beef. And then pork sausage. A lot of times your pork sausage is going to have it's going to have spices in it. It'll be a little bit discolored because of the salt and nitrite that's in it. So you're going to see, and it'll maybe in patties. So if you see what looks like ground pork that maybe has some spices in it, you may need to think about calling it sausage. And then you can also have sausage links in pork. The hocks are something that is also found in the various primal. Hocks are one where you're going to see a bone or maybe a couple of bones and lots of little muscles. They're not very large. There's lots of gristle and connective tissue. They're sometimes, a lot of the time, they'll still have the skin on them. And then there's also the smoked version. And again, you'll just want to look for that brown coloration and smell for smoke. All right, moving on into lamb. If we'll start back up in the shoulder of lamb, the first thing we have is the square cut or square cut whole. It's a big square chunk of lamb. There's lots of little muscles. On one corner, you'll see a blade bone. On another side, you'll see the arm bone. You're going to see ribs. You'll see where the neck comes out. It's a big hunk of bony lamb. And you'll know that you're looking at a lamb shoulder square cut. Now you can take that lamb shoulder and you can chop it up from the blade side and turn that into blade chops. Those blade chops are going to have blade bone, and then they'll have the backbone in them as well. All the cuts from lamb except for the center slice are chops. So you're not going to have any steaks from lamb no matter where they're from. You know you're in the front end because you got lots of little muscles, lots of bones. You can look, you could slice chops from the bottom down here on the arm side and get arm chops. A lot of times the arm chops are still going to have ribs in them. You've got your round bone next to your round muscle. You've got that long skinny muscle. That tells you you're in the front end. These are pretty easy to identify. There's only one cut that comes from the lamb breast primal, and that's going to be ribs Denver style. And these are similar to like short ribs in beef, and they're just the bottom or the ventral portion of the rib that's been sliced. It's going to be straight on both sides. It's not going to be very long. It's only maybe 8 to 10 inches long. The bones are really small. You can see them in there. You may see part of the diaphragm. A whole bunch of ribs lined up like this. You know you're looking at a lamb breast ribs Denver style. In the lamb rack, you've got rib chops. You know you're looking at rib chops because there's not going to be a blade bone in them. They look like a little bitty ribeye. You're going to have a little bitty rib bone in them. The fun thing about lamb is that sometimes they'll take a bone and they'll strip all the meat off of it and kind of create a little handle there, and they call that Frenched style. And so you might have a Frenched style rib chop where you have a little handle sticking off the edge of the rib chop. And that's going to be a different cut from a regular rib chop, so you need to look for that if you see the bone sticking out there. The rib roast will have a rib chop on one end, a blade chop on the other. You may have as many as 8 ribs in that cut. There's also a Frenched style rib roast where the little bones are sticking out here, and sometimes they'll even have little cute, cappers on top of those bones. Moving on into the lamb loin. The lamb loin chop looks like a little bitty T-bone. It'll have the top loin side and the tenderloin. It's always going to be bone in. There's only one cut from lamb that's boneless. Everything else is going to have bones in it. The loin roast is going to look like a loin chop on one end and a rib chop on the other. You need to go look for that T-bone, little bitty T-bone on one end, and it's going to have a tenderloin. Now, from the lamb leg, you've got sirloin chops. When the butcher cuts up a lamb into primals, they remove the leg up here in front of the pelvic bone, so that leaves all of these sirloin cuts in the lamb leg. And so sirloin chops come from the lamb leg, not the loin. Because you're cutting up the pelvic bone, you're going to have all kinds of different shapes. You're going to see that half moon shape sirloin with the little chunk of connective tissue in it that we talked about in the other species. And you'll know, and then those funny bone shapes, you know you're looking at a sirloin chop. Just remember to say that it's in the leg. Then the roast that's associated with that is called the sirloin half, and you'll see that big chunk of pelvic bone. You'll see the pelvic cavity there. You'll be able to see the lamb's tail in that sirloin half roast. Lambs also have a center slice, just like pork does, that comes from the leg, but it's smaller. They look like little tiny round steaks. So you'll have the 3 pieces of the round, and it's got a little bone in the middle. Really easy lamb leg center slice. They do a French style on the lamb leg roast as well. It's got that bone that sticks out there, the meat stripped away from the bone, and it's a whole leg. And then lamb has what they call an American style roast, where they've actually removed the bone and they've folded that meat under, and that makes it an American style. It still has bone on this end, but they've removed this big long bone and they folded that meat under to create an American style roast. Lamb only has one various cut, and that's the shank, and it just looks like a little leg. It comes off of the front end, and that's pretty much what it is. It's just a little leg. It's a various from the various primal. Okay, now we're going to talk a few minutes about variety meats, and then we're done. So, all 3 species have, well, you may see hearts from all 3 species. You may see tongue from all 3 species. If you see, hearts are really easy to identify. They look like a heart, like you've seen in a health book in school. And if it's as big as a basketball, it's a beef heart. If it's as big as about 2 fists, and usually they're a little bit lighter in color, it's going to be a pork heart. And if it's about as big as 1 fist, it's a lamb heart. Beef tongues are really large, and sometimes you'll see some coloration on them. They're going to be over a foot long. Sometimes they're folded up because of the way they're packaged. It's very obvious that it's tongue. Pork tongue is a little smaller. It's going to be about 8 inches. And then lamb tongue is even smaller. Kidneys, so you'll see those from all 3 species. The way you know you're looking at a beef kidney is it's really knobby. It doesn't look like a kidney you see in a health book. It's got these knobs in it. So that's a beef kidney. These are going to be probably about half the size of a football, or maybe about 2/3 the size of a football. They're still pretty good size. A pork kidney is about as big as, they're a little bit bigger than like a deck of cards, and they're kind of oblong compared to what you think about a kidney looking like. They're a little bit oblong and flatter. And then the lamb kidney looks like what, if you drew a picture of a kidney from a health textbook, that's what a lamb kidney, they look like little kidney beans. Really easy to identify. Beef livers are huge. They would cover up the whole table if the whole thing was there. So that's a really, really big cut. The pork liver is going to have the big lobes in it. So you'll know you're looking at pork when it's got these lobes. And then lamb liver is quite a bit smaller, but it's still liver is a big organ. A lamb liver is still going to be 8 or 10 inches, maybe even 12 inches across. A couple of variety meats that are specific to beef. Last is the oxtail. It's just sliced pieces of tail. And then the tripe is a cut that comes from the stomach lining. It's got a lot of texture in it. A lot of times it's folded. You can find tripe in a lot of grocery stores if it's just something you want to go look and find. So it's a lot of times it's folded, it's white, it's bleached. It's really easy to identify, and it's a beef variety meat.